Okay, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Adam Novak. I'm the moderator on behalf of Global Dialogue and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So welcome to this international webinar focusing on the geopolitical aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar is in English, French, and Spanish. If you want to listen in one of those languages, you should click on the interpretation button if you're listening in Zoom, and select the language you want to listen in. So we have an international panel with us today. We've got Dorothy Guerrero from Global Justice Now in the UK, with a very long and broad global activist experience. Fatima Hassan from the Health Justice Initiative in South Africa. Gonzalo Basile from Claxo in Latin America, who still didn't join us, but we're trying to get him. Jorge Bermudez from Fiocruz in Brazil. And Kate Lapin, who's the Regional Secretary for PSI, Trade Union Federation for Asia Pacific, who's kindly stepped in at the last minute to replace a colleague who's unfortunately sick. So we have 90 minutes for this webinar, and the structure is I'm first going to invite each of the panelists to make a few opening remarks on whichever theme you know, I never wanted a cuckoo clock in the house, and now I'm confirmed correct in my choice. Sorry about that. We ask each of the participants to talk for a few minutes on the themes which are most relevant to them. Of course, our situations, depending on the sector we work in and the country where we are active, can be very different. And then we'll move to an exchange between the panelists. You're welcome to make comments and suggestions in the chat function of the Zoom webinar, or to the people who are joining us on the Facebook live streams in English, French, and Spanish. You can make your comments in the Facebook chat. So then, first of all, then I'll turn to you, Dorothy, for a few opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, and also thank you for organizing this, and thank you all for joining us this morning and deciding to spend your morning with us. Well, my organization, Global Justice Now, is based in the UK. We have offices in London and Edinburgh, and we approach this vaccine apartheid problem in different ways. We're trying to pressure the UK government to agree to the TRIPS waiver. We're targeting the big pharmas to also give their recipes to other manufacturers and make the you know, forget about the waiver, because this is the time where they don't, I mean, they are allowed to have to earn money, of course, and have their profits, but this is not the time to accumulate crazy profits when people are dying. So I think we're also mobilizing our members. We have members in all over the UK, also to push their MPs so that the UK government will agree to this. So let me start with the fact that there is vaccine apartheid. Everybody is not on the same boat here as we navigate the global coronavirus storm. Rich countries are vaccinating 1 person every second, while the majority of the poorest nations are still waiting. Here in the UK, the successful vaccine rollout already reached almost 46.3 million people out of 67.6 million population as of last Sunday. So that means more than 33.7 million people have now received their first dose, and almost 12.6 million are fully vaccinated. People who are in their 40s are now getting the vaccines. On one hand, of course, we are thankful that we have a national health service, which is providing the vaccines for free for almost everybody. I said almost everybody because also many migrants are not getting it, especially those without papers, which is also an issue campaigners are tackling, and we're trying to solve that problem as well. So more and more within the population are getting aware that countries in the global south are only hoping to get it within this year at least. For many like me with immediate families who are living in countries in the south, in my case, my immediate family is in the Philippines. My mom is still there. It is, of course, hard to think that I got my vaccines last month while my 78-year-old mom is still waiting, and my whole family are not safe. There is that situation that rich countries like the UK, those in the European Union, in the US, and in other rich countries already bought up enough doses well in advance, and that these they bought even before they are manufactured. There is enough doses in supply to vaccinate the entire UK population at least 3 times over by the end of this year. So some ask the question, what is wrong with that? Or even say, hello, we're not stockpiling vaccines. We are just playing safe when we ordered them last year, as we don't know which ones are good. Or it's like how people here in Europe rush to supermarkets and empty shelves of toilet papers just to be sure they have a whole year supply or even more. The thing is, it's different. What is important to understand here is that the scarcity should not be the case. The countries that stockpile on supplies are also blocking the attempts of developing countries to increase the number of laboratories or companies that could manufacture more vaccines. This is through blocking the request by countries led by India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization to waive certain intellectual property rights in the TRIPS agreement, which is now supported by 60 countries. These property rights or patent rights will not help everyone under a global health emergency because it is stopping smaller manufacturers to produce more vaccines desperately needed now. So as an example, for example, BioLise, a small pharmaceutical manufacturer in Canada, asked coronavirus vaccine recipe from AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson last year. It has capacity to produce 20 million doses for this year for nations in the global south. It also asked the Canadian government to help it with compulsory licensing, which would give it the authorization to produce another company's patented product for emergency use. But so far, it could not proceed. So in the developing countries, when people ask, do they even have the capacity? Can they manufacture the vaccine? Well, there are those companies in Bangladesh, for example, there's Incepta. And in India, of course, even in the Philippines, some big manufacturers are partnering with Philippine companies. So that means there is that capacity. From an article published in The Guardian last Saturday, it says that about 430 million COVID vaccines doses have been produced so far this year, enough for about 215 million people. And of the doses already given, about half has gone to the richest 16% of the world population. This is unacceptable. And even COVAX, the World Health Organization initiative to counter vaccine nationalism and transfer vaccines to 97 nations in need, it only delivered 38 million doses. At the rate of production and distribution that is happening, nations in the global south may not reach widespread vaccination until 2023. And time here is the essence because every day, every month that the population is not vaccinated, there is that possibility that the virus can mutate. In the Philippines, it's already mutated. In India, in Brazil. So there are all these problems that may even pose a danger that the current vaccine may not be effective anymore for those mutations. Then I would like to go to the vaccine politics, the geopolitics of vaccines. Um, the vaccines are probably good. The government that has committed money, in the UK, for example, £475 million were given to COVID-19 research and development, and that's why we are pushing the UK government to also extend the vaccine to developing countries. Globally, the vaccines that have been approved have all benefited from billions in public funding. Some estimate says 93 billion in euro in the EU. So as industry in the US as well, as industry lobbying has escalated in Washington, companies have warned because there is a strong pressure for Biden to agree to the TRIPS waiver. Private meetings with US trade and White House officials there is news that giving up the intellectual property rights could allow China and Russia to exploit platforms such as the mRNA, which could be used for other vaccines or even therapeutics for conditions such as cancer and health problems in the future. Catherine Tai, the Trade Secretary of the US, also mentioned that she now wanted to put this on review, meaning who knows, they might agree despite the strong lobby. So while wealthy nations pile up surplus supplies, both Russia and China are doing their vaccine diplomacy by sending their vaccines directly to Africa and other developing countries. Russian and Chinese companies have also been more willing than their Western counterparts to strike licensing deals to allow manufacturers in places such as Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, and other countries to partly or fully produce COVID-19 vaccines. The Chinese and Russian vaccines use different approaches from mRNA. The technology first deployed in an approved product for COVID-19 vaccine. President Xi Jinping in the Biden summit mentioned that China vowed to make vaccines a global public good. Shipping free vaccines is totally different from shipping arms for war, as vaccines are desperately needed and wanted by people all over. Of the near 250 million vaccines that China produced, or meaning doses that China produced so far, China has sent 118 million to 49 countries, according to Airfinity. It's a pharmaceuticals analytics company based in London. Russia has sent vaccines to 22 different countries, and India has exported or donated 64 million of the nearly 150 million shots it has produced. Some experts are saying or interpreting this as New Delhi's attempt to counterpart the vaccine diplomacy overtures of its regional rival, Beijing. Of course, that's for another discussion. But I think I will end by saying we need to end big pharma monopoly. If vaccine manufacturers or producers in China, in Russia, and even Cuba, which is suffering from blockade, imagine if they're not suffering from blockade, they could have produced more and they could have more freedom to send it to other countries. So I think we need to end the big pharma monopoly. We need to end their profiteering because the pandemic is not the time to do so. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I use more time.
No, thanks, Dorothy. And I think also that's a great introduction to some of the themes which I'm sure are concerning all of us. So Fatima, I hand the floor over to you for your own global, but specifically South African perspective.
Thanks, and thanks, Dorothy. I think Dorothy has explained, quite clearly why we're in a situation where 1 in 4 people in the global north have already received a vaccine, and 1 in 500 people in the global south have only received the vaccine. And so that disparity really is linked to, quite a pernicious form of vaccine nationalism that we've seen in the last year in this pandemic, and what we call vaccine apartheid. And my sense of the situation is that this is not unexpected. It's what we all predicted about a year ago, given sort of our experience in the access to medicine movement, particularly around the HIV/AIDS crisis and other epidemics as well. Because usually when you have the pharmaceutical industry made to be in charge of determining access of life-saving interventions and supplies for most people in the global north and global south, you will have a deference to political interests or what you would call geopolitical realities, because that, I think, is rooted in this ideological clinging to intellectual property as being sacrosanct and as being more sacrosanct than human life. And so there's in this pandemic, I think what we've seen with the situation in Brazil and India playing out in the last few weeks in particular, and it's quite a concerning and quite a worrying situation that is unfolding, because it didn't have to actually be that way, because we have the tools and the scientific knowledge that could actually, allow many countries in the global south to have a very different response to the epidemic at this stage of where we're at with scientific knowledge. So there's a deference to intellectual property, and I think that is rooted in the political interests of a few nations. And I think that's most clearly sort of illustrated through the handful of nations that are opposing the TRIPS waiver. So the way in which the geopolitical realities are affecting vaccine access globally, and particularly in the global south, and even in my own country in South Africa, which, by the way, we haven't even started our vaccination program because we're still waiting for supplies to come from Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, because we've now decided not to use AstraZeneca. And I'll come back to the geopolitical implications of South Africa's decision not to use AstraZeneca as part of its vaccine selection, and how that has impacted the AU, the African Union's decision around its vaccine selection for many parts in Africa. So it's playing out in the vaccine selection. It's playing out in relation to the vaccine injury schemes that are having to be set up by many countries in the global south to suit some of the demands or the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. It's playing out in relation to how much transparency you will have or how much secrecy you will enable or allow. It's playing out in the ideological debate and arguments, particularly at the WTO, on whether you regard vaccines or any of the diagnostics and technologies that could manage and treat COVID-19 as a public good. And then it's most clearly, I think, played out in the last 2 weeks in terms of, do you have enough supplies? Why don't you have enough supplies? Who has access to supplies? Who's willing to donate them? Who's willing to give up intellectual property so that you can scale up manufacturing? And then it's obviously the last element of the way in which politics is affecting our entire management of this epidemic is in relation to the TRIPS waiver. So just for the purposes of this short introduction, I'll just focus on only a few: the vaccine selection aspect, the sufficient supplies aspect, and the TRIPS waiver. So in relation to the vaccine selection, what has happened is that because of this clinging on to intellectual property claims and rights, and this deference to intellectual property and not scaling up enough manufacturing, we obviously had a supply crisis in Africa. As a result of that supply crisis, China and Russia were able to offer hundreds of thousands of supplies of their particular vaccines. It's already being used in some countries in Africa, even where they may not have got regulatory approval or where they may have got emergency regulatory approval. The situation in South Africa, even though Russia and South Africa are part of BRICS, the Sputnik vaccine is not yet selected as the official, as part of the official program, because the dossier has just been submitted, and until you get regulatory approval, you can't use that. But the dossier now has been submitted. In relation to Sinovac and Sinopharm, again, you can't just roll out those vaccines without regulatory approval. Those dossiers have eventually been submitted. So it remains to be seen whether South Africa then opens up beyond Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer and starts using both Sinovac, Sinopharm, as well as Sputnik, because in both cases of Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, not just for South Africa, but the rest of Africa and for the African Union's benefit, the supplies are coming in on a drip feed basis. So for example, Dorothy's talking about the extent of vaccination in the UK or in the EU. I, as a person who's under 60 with no comorbidity, my appointment will only be in February or March 2022. Right, because of the forecast of the limited supplies that will come in from Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. So should you have a situation where Sputnik, Sinovac, Sinopharm gets regulatory approval, is able to give you supplies much faster than Johnson & Pfizer, then obviously the South African government is going to make use of that. The AstraZeneca pause by South Africa has any implications beyond just South Africa's borders. That decision has meant that the reliance on Johnson & Johnson to now provide supplies to South Africa, and I think a lot of these so-called Western companies are fearful that a lot of African countries, the bedrock of their vaccine selection programs are going to be Russian or Chinese vaccines. So they're now coming forward and sort of making commitments for 20 million doses here, 30 million doses there. But that decision by South Africa to not use AstraZeneca's vaccine has had an impact on the African Union's vaccine selection decision, who've also said they won't use AstraZeneca and instead are likely to get about 200 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So I think the vaccine wars are also being played out by these particular companies in terms of the vaccine selection. The question then will be, can you deliver 200 million vaccines before the end of the year? How long will it take for you to make sure that the supplies actually reach the different countries? And already, like I said, if you look at this very valuable website by Media Hack and Vakisisa, you can see in each African country that they're using whatever vaccines they can get their hands on. In some countries, they're using Sinovac, Sinopharm, Sputnik, and AstraZeneca. And now some of them are also using Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And that's obviously having diplomatic, implications as well. It's interesting in South Africa, just an anecdote. We found out that they're considering using Sinovac and Sinopharm because in court papers that were brought by what I regard as a right-wing trade union to try and get the private sector to be able to procure vaccines, government admitted that the Chinese embassy was facilitating the conversations between the South African government in terms of potentially using Sinovac and Sinopharm. So clearly embassies are also playing a specific role. And I think a lot of ambassadors from Western countries are very concerned that Africa is going to, make use of greater use of supplies from China and Russia. And so they're trying to push some kind of stuff. That's also playing out in terms of the manufacturing agreements that some of the companies are deciding to now issue. So there's a fill and finish license for Johnson & Johnson for Aspen Pharmacare. And as you know, Moderna basically attended the Africa Manufacturing Capacity meeting a few weeks ago. And there's some talk that Moderna may actually set up a plant in Rwanda. So, I think if somebody starts plotting and tracking, you'll see sort of the different spheres of influence. Let me just finally end off by the issue of how politics is playing out in what I call the charity complex, or what other people are calling donations or excess supplies. So first I'd like to say, if you're hoarding in a pandemic, you're a gouger, you're a pandemic gouger. And if you're donating supplies in a pandemic, it means that you're over-ordered and you're probably hoarding and you have excess supplies. Because how can it be that you have 800,000 supplies just sitting around that you can now just donate to another country, right? Which means that you over-ordered through your bilaterals and you also over-ordered through the COVAX facility. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have done some great work on showing who is over-ordered in which regions and how that is playing out. So your ability to donate or give away supplies is primarily rooted in the fact that you're hoarded in the first place, and that is why you have excess supplies. But the way in which that's playing out is that France, the US, and Norway have decided that they're now going to share vaccines. The New Zealand government has now donated about 800,000 of what it calls excess supplies back to the COVAX facility. And yet there are countries that are considered high income in COVAX who are still waiting for supplies. For example, Australia had a bit of a supply blockage, and Canada as well. Right. So the role that the Biden administration is now being asked to play almost as a savior, like send supplies to India, send support to Brazil, give away access supplies of AstraZeneca dosages to other parts of the world that are basically facing a public health crisis, I think is also interesting to watch. And I really think that this is not something we should be congratulating them for. This is something which actually shows the argument that we've been making for over a year, that you need to scale up manufacturing in order to deal with this in a more equitable way. So what the EU does in the next few weeks, what the Biden administration does in the next few weeks around the export bans, where the countries in the global south that may get some licenses also introduce export bans, what the relationship will be amongst BRIC partners about how we deal with the scarcity, I think will also be interesting to watch. And my final, comment around the TRIPS waiver, and we can deal with that in the Q&A session about how politics is playing out there, the diplomatic pressure, the momentum, the lobbyists that have been hired to basically block the South Africa and India request for the TRIPS waiver, is that Brazil is our trade partner in BRICS, right? But because of the political situation in Brazil, Brazil is not supporting the TRIPS waiver. That in itself tells you that there's a massive diplomatic row between Brazil, India, and South Africa around the fact that one of our own trade partners is basically not supporting the TRIPS waiver for no good reason. So let me stop there and hand over to Gonzalo.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fatima. We'll come back to some of those issues later. A reminder to everybody who's with us that we have simultaneous interpretation between English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. I know Gonzalo is going to speak in Spanish. If anyone wants to listen in English, you go to the interpretation button if you're listening in Zoom, and then click on the language that you want to listen to. Okay, but if people want to make comments, you can just make your comments in the chat in any of those 4 languages. So now I pass the floor to Gonzalo Basile from Argentina, from the Claxo network, for some introductory remarks.
Hello. Buenos días, buenas tardes, dependiendo el lugar geopolítico donde estemos ubicadas y ubicados. Muchas gracias por la invitación desde el Programa de Salud Internacional del Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales y también de la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales. Es un placer estar hoy aquí participando. Yo voy a tratar de, digamos, como Adam comentó ahí, que es una breve introducción a un argentino y un latinoamericano. Eso es decirse, digamos, que sea breve siempre es complicado, digamos, pero trataremos de hacer el esfuerzo introductorio, digamos. Lo primero que me gustaría, digamos, referirme es muy rápidamente al concepto de guerra, ¿no? O sea, el concepto del propio foro, del propio panel, porque algunos de nosotros venimos bastante conflictuados con el estado de guerra sobre una enfermedad, ¿no? O sea, sobre todo porque es un lenguaje sanitario y epidemiológico que no viene solo del SARS-CoV-2, sino que ya viene de ébola y de otras crisis epidemiológicas internacionales, y en general, digamos, de alguna manera ese estado de guerra, digamos, suele tener toda una dinámica y una lógica, ¿no? De, como llamamos a veces, actividades de paracaidistas, ¿no? Donde se bombean recursos financieros, recursos humanos, recursos médicos sanitarios a un brote o emergencia de salud pública para sofocar, digamos, de alguna manera el incendio epidemiológico y el estado, digamos, y combatir una guerra epidemiológica que tenemos en particular, para tratar de alguna manera de incidir en la distribución o en la tendencia de esa enfermedad, pero que de alguna manera muchas veces esto, primero que nos invisibiliza, y ahora me voy a referir justamente a eso para pensar las vacunas, nos invisibiliza sistemáticamente cuáles son los procesos estructurantes, o diríamos nosotros las determinaciones internacionales y globales de la salud colectiva, digamos, para estar frente a esta crisis epidemiológica, por qué la afectación diferencial entre el norte global y el sur, y por qué ese estado de guerra nos coloca en un lenguaje del nexo entre la seguridad y la salud, en ese concepto de seguridad sanitaria global del norte global, que de alguna manera nos plantea la comprensión de las crisis epidemiológicas como amenazas de la seguridad nacional, como, digamos, respuestas de aparatos de securitización y de militarización a las crisis epidemiológicas, y que creo que desde el sur tenemos que problematizar un poco ese lenguaje de guerra. Y porque además, frente a la guerra, digamos, ¿no? Y a la geopolítica de la guerra, lo que suele quedar después de una guerra son daños colaterales y escombros, ¿no? O sea, digamos, o destrucción, digamos. Entonces, creo que hay que, digamos, de alguna manera repensar todo el lenguaje que el SARS-CoV-2 nos ha instalado muy fuerte con respecto a esta cuestión, digamos, del estado de la guerra, digamos. El segundo comentario muy rápido, que ya entrando en el tema vacunas, que me gustaría referirme, es un poco a tratar de comprender a América Latina y el Caribe, y su debate o la reflexión o pensamiento sobre el tema de vacunas, acceso a vacunas, las vacunas como bien público global, pensado desde desde una especificidad, ¿no? O sea, América Latina y el Caribe es pensar desde una especificidad que podríamos llamarla de el capitalismo mundialmente periférico, digamos, y cómo desde ese capitalismo mundialmente periférico nos encontramos frente a algunas dinámicas, no solamente de lo que tiene que ver con el comportamiento del complejo médico-industrial farmacéutico global, ¿no? Y de alguna manera cómo ese complejo está gobernando de alguna forma el ciclo de respuesta a esta crisis epidemiológica en el plano de todo lo que tiene que ver, ¿no?, con investigación, desarrollo, producción y distribución de las vacunas. Después podemos, seguramente Jorge también nos hablará un poco de algunas capacidades que tiene América Latina y el Caribe de soberanía sanitaria y de producción, digamos, ¿no?, de producción nacional de algunos países que América Latina está en la fase a la respuesta. Pero me gustaría detenerme que en esa especificidad de alguna manera geopolítica, digamos, una geopolítica de poder y una geopolítica de conocimiento, de alguna manera, yo lo que diría es cómo repensar de alguna manera los lentes o los anteojos o las formas de cómo hemos estado analizando esta crisis pandémica global y epidémica regional, pero sobre todo, digamos, comprender o asumir que existen un poco lo que nosotros denominamos como las determinaciones internacionales de la salud, digamos, y esas determinaciones internacionales de alguna forma digamos, implican comprender un entramado muy complejo de condicionantes, de adversidades en multiniveles, que en esa especificidad del espacio geopolítico latinoamericano y caribeño implican, digamos, todo lo que ya conocemos de, primero, la situación de dependencia de nuestras periferias hacia el centro, digamos, y esa situación de dependencia también implica una dependencia sanitaria, es decir, una dependencia sanitaria a lo que conocemos como el complejo médico-industrial farmacéutico, donde muy rápidamente, como ya nos habremos enterado, exceptuando quizás Cuba, el resto de los países latinoamericanos y caribeños rápidamente nos colocamos en espacios o en lugares de lo que pudiéramos llamar como compradores periféricos dependientes del complejo médico-industrial farmacéutico, o bien de producciones de algunas geopolíticas, como recién planteaban en el caso de Rusia o China, pero siempre en un lugar de periferia, de compradores y de situación dependiente en la particularidad geopolítica de América Latina, ¿no? Entonces, un poco esta comprensión, si quieren, del multinivel digamos, de determinación internacional, creo que es importante denunciar inicialmente, porque de alguna manera el concepto, si quieren, de determinación internacional de la salud, por lo menos para el campo de la soberanía sanitaria en América Latina y el Caribe, para el campo del pensamiento crítico latinoamericano en salud, implica, digamos, de alguna manera poner en discusión o poner en reflexión cómo se ha producido la distribución diferencial de lo que yo diría recursos de dominación, recursos de explotación y recursos, si quieren, de adversidad o sometimiento, digamos, y que de alguna manera esos recursos, ¿no?, determinan o producen determinaciones estructurantes en términos de la salud y la vida, ¿no? Y que de alguna manera esas distribuciones estructurantes que tenemos, que atraviesan el campo de la salud internacional, traen todas estas cuestiones de los supuestos de órdenes superiores e inferiores, clasificaciones y categorías de análisis muy vinculadas a las teorías del desarrollo. Entonces las propias farmacéuticas han estructurado incluso hasta los precios de la vacuna y la lógica de acceso a las vacunas de acuerdo, ¿no?, a todas nuestras clasificaciones, digamos, de países desarrollados, en vías de desarrollo, o más pobres, bueno, y todas las otras clasificaciones que también permean nuestras sociedades. Pero lo que me gustaría dejar claro ahí es que de alguna manera frente a un sistema global de reproducción, ¿no? Y que de alguna manera es un sistema mundo que nos plantea unas lógicas y coordenadas en términos de presunciones de un patrón de poder, de un patrón de conocimiento, pero también de estructuras que reproduce ese patrón en cuanto a las lógicas de gobernanza en el campo de la salud internacional, y después quizás más adelante me pueda detener en las implicancias, ¿no?, de lo que llamaríamos la colonialidad sanitaria que reproduce aún hoy la Organización Mundial de la Salud, ciertos organismos internacionales, por qué el mecanismo de acceso a las vacunas terminó gobernado por el Gavi y por CEPI, ¿no?, por la coalición del Foro Mundial de Davos, en caso de CEPI, y digamos el Gavi en el Fondo Mundial de Vacunas, digamos, es decir, cómo esas estructuras de poder de alguna manera naturalizan diferencias que después, claro, se clasifican, se codifican, digamos, implican valorizaciones, pero que de alguna forma lo que me gustaría dejar claro es que para América Latina y el Caribe, frente a este sistema global de reproducción y de estructuración de determinaciones internacionales de la salud, que de alguna manera determinan, como explicaba recién, adversidades, condicionantes, geopolíticas de poder y conocimiento, solemos enunciar, incluso en la región de América Latina y el Caribe, solemos enunciar tesis nacionales para su afrontamiento y para su respuesta. Es decir, tesis nacionales que van desde la discusión, como decía recién, de compradores periféricos dependientes, es decir, donde cada país latinoamericano y caribeño ha quedado su Estado, su gobierno o la propia sociedad embarcada, diría yo, o atrapada, ¿no?, en estos condicionantes y adversidades, reproduciendo cómo acceder a una cantidad de dosis, digamos, muy atentos a las distintas partidas, de las distintas compras, de los distintos contratos, y qué accesos nos da cada contrato, es decir, y ahí se entrecruzan distintas geopolíticas, ¿no?, porque ustedes saben que uno de los grandes proveedores en el caso de Sudamérica y de Centroamérica y el Caribe también está Rusia, digamos, Rusia y China, pero en realidad también, bueno, había un gran contrato, digamos, que fracasó, digamos, que era el contrato de la AstraZeneca con Matt Vines, un laboratorio privado argentino de una multinacional argentina, y el grupo Carlos Slim. Es decir, pero nuestra forma de comprensión en América Latina a este debate y a este sistema global de reproducción y de gobernanza, ¿no?, tanto de gobernanza a nivel global como de gobernanza del propio complejo médico-farmacéutico global, gobernando el ciclo, ¿no?, el ciclo de respuesta en términos de las vacunas. Me parece interesante también preguntarnos por qué América Latina y el Caribe encaró este proceso de manera tan desintegrada, tan fragmentada, de alguna manera descoordinada, donde cada uno de nuestros estados, países y territorialidades geopolíticas han quedado, como decía recién, o bien dependientes y como compradores, o bien en negociaciones y planteamientos particulares. Es decir, recién hace menos de una semana algunos países esbozaron, no solo Bolivia estaba hablando de poner en discusión las patentes de las vacunas y de las vacunas como bienes globales universales, pero poner en discusión las patentes para producción de bioequivalencia y demás. Bolivia lo venía planteando, ahora acompaña a Argentina y algunos otros países, pero en realidad, digamos, ya sabemos que esto es, digamos, una cuestión muy tardía, porque ya muchos de nuestros países ya hicieron compras consolidadas a distintas digamos, producciones y proveedores de vacunas. Entonces, creo que ahí digamos, yo lo que dejaría como planteamiento inicial es cómo trabajar con una unidad de análisis, es decir, qué unidad de análisis, ¿no?, en términos de escala espacial, si podemos seguir pensando las determinaciones internacionales y todo el debate de vacunas desde una unidad de análisis de los estados-nación, digamos, y en realidad yo creo que hay que pensar una unidad de análisis y de escala temporal y de escala espacial mucho más amplia, digamos, primero porque nuestros condicionantes desde el sur son, digamos, nuestras unidades de análisis vienen, como dirían nuestros autores latinoamericanos, sobre bases coloniales, es decir, y sobre una reproducción de colonialidad de poder y de conocimiento en el campo sanitario, pero además porque nuestras bases de análisis y de escala espacial y escala temporal también tiene que ser más larga en términos de cómo construir autonomía y soberanía no solamente frente a esta coyuntura particular de la crisis del SARS-CoV-2 y de la crisis del acceso a las vacunas, sino una coyuntura de cómo pensar una estrategia, digamos, ¿no?, en términos regionales y en términos de soberanía sanitaria, que de alguna manera no nos deje, de alguna manera no nos coloque, digamos, todo el tiempo peleando por separado, o digamos luchando, ¿no?, o particularmente afrontando debates o problemas epidemiológicos, sanitarios por separado, pero de alguna manera terminar, digamos, todos nuestros territorios y países derrotados todos juntos en términos de las relaciones, digamos, como decía recién, del sistema mundo contemporáneo tan asimétrico, desigual y deshumano que nos plantea este capitalismo no acelerado del siglo XXI. Así que ahí me voy a detener.
Thanks a lot, Gonzalo. So we stay in Latin America, but now we wanted to get a Brazilian perspective. Of course, Brazil, although the alarming news from India has led to a lot of focus on the suffering, the needless suffering in that country. Brazil, of course, is also a country characterized by serious failures in the public health response, in part due to the macho authoritarian biopolitics of President Bolsonaro. So we're happy to have with us Jorge Bermudez, who was with us in our previous webinar on these themes. So Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm not discussing restricted to Brazil, but I want to make a global view of how I think of this geopolitics of vaccine and the vaccine war, of course. But my initial words are to acknowledge the organizers, of course, the global dialogue and the global tapestry of alternatives, and express the satisfaction of sharing this debate with eminent speakers from countries directly involved in this issue and currently following the debate. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the world has been confronted with two approaches and two alternatives: or solidarity and equity access for all the people in all the world, considering health technologies to confront COVID-19 as global public goods, or commercial interests prevailing in market-based disputes with a segmentation of access and exclusion. This last mode is promoting what we are calling health apartheid, with access to vaccines in its core, or namely, as mentioned in the title of this debate, the vaccine war. The lack of treatment for the disease and its rapid transmission worldwide and the necessary containment measures led all the world to have hope on the early development and availability of vaccines. And then we had this development. Clinical trials, regulatory approval of several different types of vaccines. All of them had record timing to enter the market in less than a year since the declaration of the pandemic. But in spite of most of the proposed vaccines having been publicly funded and coming from the USA, Europe, the UK, China, Russia, India, and Cuba, most of them were subject to the so-called advanced market commitments, a mechanism that anticipates procurement even prior to regulatory approval. The setting up of COVAX by WHO, Gavi Alliance, and CEPI, and I agree with Gonzalo's remarks, was initially welcomed by the world as a mechanism which would be expecting to deliver at least 2 billion doses of a mix of vaccines during the year of 2021, including the provision of vaccines to poor countries without the payment capacity to vaccinate their populations. In our region, the Americas, 5 countries have been included in this category that receive vaccines for free from COVAX. They are Haiti, Bolivia, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Nevertheless, the COVAX delivers are not near enough, even claiming that they have delivered more than 40 million doses to 118 countries. That reaches very small numbers in those countries, much less than 5 or 10% of the populations. Last week, we saw in the Spanish journal El País that as Honduras is one of the worst prepared countries in our region with the vaccination process, it may take 569 weeks, that would be 11 years, to vaccinate all its population. And I ask, is this acceptable? Is this fair? At the same time that countries have vaccines stocked that will not be necessary, that not be used by them. Not only Honduras, but many middle or low income and the least developed countries are estimated to take years to reach high coverage of their populations with COVID-19 vaccine, unless we take a massive effort to scale up global production, strengthen the supply chain, as well as health systems, and ensure access worldwide. For me, it needs to be framed as a moral and ethical obligation and make sure that it is embraced by all the UN organizations, governments, the public sector, the private sector, manufacturers, civil society, and all possible and potential stakeholders. And at this point, we come into a crossroad when we identified two sides of the vaccine war. Either we scale up manufacturing capacity, including developing countries' capacity. Gonzalo mentioned this very clearly in his talk, in order to reach the 7.9 billion world population, or we will be fated to maintain the health apartheid, vaccinating the North and delaying access to the South for several or for many years. It is clear to the world that intellectual property is a barrier to access and that it is slowing the scaling up of vaccines. According to a recent article last week by Paul Adler in the Washington Post, he mentioned that vaccines such as those for coronavirus may require around 200 individual components, most of them patent protected by different corporations. So we know that voluntary licenses will never be enough, will not be reliable, and may narrow, and surely will narrow geographic scope, as we have seen in the past with different technologies. Even the recent proposal by WHO establishing a COVID-19 mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub will take time, and many people, many countries, and especially vulnerable populations will be left behind. They will not reach vaccines. So we think that the waiver that was proposed at the WTO last October by India and South Africa, currently backed by 2/3 of the WTO members, but fiercely opposed by the rich countries and the pharmaceutical manufacturers, is considered by many of us as the way forward and as the best way to accelerate the expansion of production beyond the large pharmaceutical companies, and at the same time paving the way to also increase voluntary licensing. For that reason, we have civil society, academics, former heads of state, Nobel laureates, politicians, members of parliament in different countries, all supporting the waiver being discussed at WTO, but confronting severe opposition, especially by the pharmaceutical industry. We saw last week the UN Economic and Social Council that has just released a statement by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, stating that the committee strongly recommends that states support the proposal of this temporary waiver, including by using their voting rights within WTO. So in conclusion, what we see is that all these initiatives should and must be framed in a multilateral cooperation and a very solid initiative, including both compulsory and also voluntary measures. Or either if we don't do that, they may be lost in the midst of different interests. And once more, the forever discussion on health and trade, or as pointed in the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines, how to address the incoherences between individual rights, public health priorities, laws and regulation on human rights, and trade rules will always be a never-ending story. And we will regret which world we are legating to future generations. So I think these were some general comments that I want to make on how we see the so-called vaccine war, but the geopolitical issues related to vaccines and to access to health technologies as a whole. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thanks a lot, Jorge. We'll come back to some of those issues in the discussion later on, I'm sure. So I'd like to now pass the floor to our last panelist, Kate Lapen, who kindly joined us to replace a colleague who is unfortunately sick. Kate is the Regional Secretary of Public Service International, the Trades Union Confederation. She's the Regional Secretary for Asia Pacific. So Kate, the floor is yours for some introductory remarks or a reaction to what the other panelists have said.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Yeah, and thanks for including PSI. Apologies from Susanna, who's unfortunately unwell, based in India. And obviously the situation in India right now is dire, as others have said. And, yeah, and for both colleagues, but also obviously for our affiliates. For those that don't know PSI, we are the Global Union Federation that represents trade unions who deliver public services, and the largest of those is in health. And so we're obviously really value this campaign around the WTO waiver because it both directly affects our members as well as it being an issue of global justice. And PSI has worked quite a bit on international trade rules and the way that they operate to the advantage of corporates and disadvantaged workers, but also the way that they act to privatise a range of public goods. And what we've found with this campaign is that it's been actually a very useful demonstration to trade unions of things that we've been campaigning around for a long time, but that trade unions don't always see the practical consequences. And in this campaign, we've actually had a lot more responses than ever before, because I think it's really obvious, no matter whether you understand trade rules or not, that these trade rules have life and death consequences and are inherently unjust and wrong. And so even some unions perhaps in countries that don't traditionally get involved with trade campaigns or from more conservative national centres have participated. And so that's one important part of this, although, you know, it's tragic that that's what's been required. Let me just say a couple of things. I mean, as I said, I haven't really prepared because I'm just stepping in for Susanna, but I guess there's two main points I really, you know, would centre some comments around. The first is obviously corporate power and the fact that we can't separate geopolitics from corporate power. What we see here is clearly not just the consequences now of big pharmaceuticals and others involved in protecting their monopolies and extending their monopolies, and the influence that they have now on a number of countries, but that these rules were drafted by them. I mean, Pfizer has gone on record to say that the WTO rules, the TRIPS, is part of their achievement, that they were part of drafting it, and that's no secret. And I think that we can't forget that you know, geopolitics is not separate to the growth of corporate power. It very much reflects, you know, the purpose of, I guess, US politics has been to protect corporate power, and that continues to be so. So, you know, I might come back to that and say a bit more about corporate power, but I just also think it's important, being from the Asia Pacific region, to say a little bit about the geopolitics in our region, which is obviously critical and growing in importance and influencing global politics extensively. And I think we can see that playing out in the waiver, although sometimes in odd ways. We know obviously that it's clear that who's opposing the WTO waiver are the group of OECD countries, and we know that they're the same countries, of course, that have secured vaccines. Mostly, I mean, I'm in Australia at the moment, and you know, Australia is one of the countries opposing the waiver and assumed that it had lined up all of its vaccines, but put all its eggs in that AstraZeneca basket and now, hunting around for ways that it could actually obtain more, although no real rush because, we don't have a problem with the virus right now. But I think what's interesting to see is that there's been a range of posturing, I guess, about the ways that countries could create new alliances to respond to the growing influence of China. So, for example, one of the main alliances now is called the Quad: India, New Zealand, India, Japan, Australia, and the US. And that Quad, of course, is trying to operate to respond to China's influence across the region and across the world, and came together to try and issue their own vaccine diplomacy initiative, which is a commitment to distribute 1 billion vaccines, but it's across the region, across South Asia and Southeast Asia by the end of 2022. That's probably, end of 2022 when other countries, rich countries, have already secured all their vaccines and vaccinated their countries. And of course, we know these timelines are also quite dubious. A lot of deadlines have been put back. But what is interesting about that is that, of course, India is one of the proponents of the waiver, and still this high-level summit by the leaders of the 4 Quad countries didn't discuss the waiver. And Australia, Japan, and the US, basically the US and its allies or proxies in the region, regularly seek India's alliance, but at the international level will not support any initiatives of theirs that are about a more just outcome for the global South. And this is an obvious one, but it also relates to things like the global tax rules. And there was recently the largest trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was signed in the region and included the ASEAN countries and China, Australia, and New Zealand, Japan, and Korea, but India withdrew. And, this is a concern, I guess, for some of this idea of the Quad, that they want to create this alliance, but find no way to actually offer something useful. And even now, with the pandemic in India and all the shortages that have been seen there, and the obvious disaster, a humanitarian disaster that's obviously unfolding, we see offers of aid and really crumbs and not a genuine change in position, which I think is both a possible reflection on Modi and his willingness to use his political power and those other countries. And as a trade union movement, we've tried a bit to look at where those points are in terms of the vulnerabilities of countries where they're responsive to or sensitive to. So, for example, we looked at having affiliates in the Pacific Island countries write to other governments, not their own. Their own governments had supported the waiver, but to other governments who are sensitive about the position of Pacific Islands because of China's influence and because, the sort of historic colonial influence of Australia and New Zealand, and asked them to support the waiver. And we got an immediate response from the New Zealand Prime Minister and relevant ministers, but not from the Australian government. And we've done the same, with other health workers in Pakistan and other places where we think there would generally be some level of sensitivity to what's happening with those workers around the world, with varying sort of outcomes. Yeah, I might also I said a little bit about corporate power. I think somebody mentioned earlier, the first speaker perhaps, about how really the vaccines are entirely almost entirely public sector funded. And I think that's important for the public to know, because the response is continuously that this can't be, the waiver can't be awarded because it would stop innovation. And yet we know that innovation comes from the public sector. And instead, we've lost some capacity for innovation with the privatisation of both vaccine research and production and the defunding of universities, and the outsourcing of intellectual property. I mean, most of this intellectual property is purchased from public sector universities and then financialized and marketed. And this is exactly the case for mRNA. And I think that's a really important case study for us, is to show that mRNA has taken 50 years to develop, but this particular technique of use that's used in the vaccines was from a scientist who had, for 3 decades had insecure contracts in the US. I think the most she ever earned was $60,000 a year. And finally, and had success with the mRNA. And then some, Moderna was set up purely to maximize the profits from that public sector research. And then, Pfizer also, and BioNTech working on her research. So it's very clearly an injustice that we as the public workers pay their taxes and have paid for this, but can't benefit for the outcomes that should be, as others have said, a universal public good. I mean, there's just multiple examples of what the fact that this is about creating scarcity and creating monopolies, and therefore extracting as much possible profit and control. And part of that is the control over which countries get it, of course, and in what order. And I think that's really critical, that story of this as a manufactured scarcity that countries could have if they really were determined to come together at the beginning of this pandemic and say, what would it take for all countries that have manufacturing capacity to produce it? We could have ended this pandemic by the end of this year. And I think that's, a bit of an untold story, and something we're trying to let our affiliates know more about. Yeah, I mean, look, the last thing I'll say, I'll leave my comments there, but I think it is important to say that the decision to sustain these monopolies and create scarcity is paid for by workers and, the global south, and I guess at the front of that is the health workers. And I think it's important that we note that health workers in particular are required to pay for those decisions, sometimes with their lives, and often, and always with the exhaustion and the stress that they're dealing with on day. And so it's not a decision that comes without consequences. It obviously is a decision that comes with, continued deaths. And so that's obviously why we will continue to campaign and hope to join all of you to sustain this pressure. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Kate. There's a lot there to think about, and I was particularly interested by what you said about trade unions and other popular movements intervening, exploiting some of the geopolitical worries of governments to try and get a little bit of leverage to win a better deal. In some countries, you used the example of the Pacific. I'm struck by that because in this part of the world, in Eastern Europe, what we see is that the liberals and the Atlanticist part of the political spectrum and their supporters are investing heavily to block and isolate any governments which are wanting to do a deal with Russia or China to obtain vaccines from there. And I think the problem for progressive movements is that the demand to not be tied only to Western vaccines as a sign of geopolitical loyalty, but to also engage with those other countries, at the moment is led by the authoritarian and far-right currents, and it's difficult to see where is the progressive point of entry beyond the the obvious demands at the national level of making vaccines available for all, not making vaccines conditional on being registered and up to date with your payments in the social security system, dealing with refugees, dealing with homeless people, and so on. But to think where, if we're going to intervene in geopolitics, what's the best entry point for that can express and carry forward our progressive demands and go beyond this camp and that camp approach. But we can come back to that. I wanted to ask the panelists, I think particularly Dorothy and Fatima, because I know you've been very involved in these the campaigns so far unsuccessful to get some kind of derogation from international property rights, and to enable a much greater and much broader production of vaccines. I mean, is this? Of course, we can continue to demand it, but where are the opportunities? Where can we push forward to win?
Yeah, should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Well, actually, this is the problem. Governments has the ability to override patents on vaccines and treatments to allow manufacturers to make that product. However, the governments has not used these powers in decades because they defer to the big pharma or to the power of pharmaceutical industries. I remember 20 years ago, this was already a fight when it comes to the medicines for HIV/AIDS, and India has been saying that we could produce it, we could produce generics, and when they did so, it really pulled down the price. So this is what the big pharmas are afraid of, which the government is, as I said, deferring to. And that's why I also mentioned the case of Canada in my presentation, because here's a small company telling its government to use the compulsory licensing as well. Well, that is one factor, but I also wanted to point out another issue here. TNI just published a paper also on global liability waiver that Big Pharma and those also that are within the COVAX are seeking when they supply COVID-19 vaccines to developing country. A counter position that they see also is that they are pushing countries to sign to this liability waiver just in case their vaccine will have ill effects to the population. So the industry, and with World Health Organization's blessing, insist on a legally binding pre-agreement to the acquisition of the technology that exempts manufacturers from liability. This was done in Latin America already. Pfizer has arm-twisted Latin American governments to sign this waiver before they supply the vaccine. It was also done in the Philippines, and the Duterte government could not do anything but push for a quick bulldoze the whole Congress and Senate to come up with a law that would allow this. So this is one thing, and we'll ride on what we call as corporate power, because apart from blocking the ability of manufacturers to manufacture the vaccines, they're also enforcing that liability waiver to countries. Then maybe later I would like to go back to the geopolitics as well, because that would be exciting.
Okay, thanks. Also, if we have time later, maybe we can also come back on the Philippines case with the recent spread of these community kitchens as a point of entry that mobilizes new people, and yeah, and so anyway, always a problem of time. Fatima, I wanted to ask you on the how can we win on the intellectual property rights?
So, I mean, I think there's a few things that's happening in the next few weeks. On the 30th of April is the next meeting of the WTO. I think one of the demands has to be that countries now have to move to text-based negotiations. So no more postponements and no more further questions and, you know, another meeting and another meeting. There's been already about 9 formal and informal meetings. So we really need to resolve this now. This can't be the same conversation we're having for at least another year. There are a few opportunities. I think what's interesting is that in the last few weeks, 170 former heads of state and Nobel laureates wrote an open letter actually supporting the waiver and the relaxation of intellectual property. So that's quite interesting. I think that may be shifting some countries' positions on the waiver. What's interesting is that if you're doing work in Ireland, Belgium, and Spain, there seems to be some shifts amongst those governments in relation to potentially not blocking a waiver, supporting a waiver. And so there's some opportunities there. And then more importantly, on the Biden administration, there's a lot of pressure that has built in the last week. There's a petition where they collected over 2 million signatures to make sure that the Biden administration doesn't block the waiver. If the US shifts its position, it's likely to be that you get a shift amongst some of the other EU member states as well. And then a number of members of different European parliaments and members of the European Parliament has also come out in support of the TRIPS waiver. So we really do believe that the momentum is building and that there is a moral argument to be made around not blocking a waiver, particularly given the situation in India and Brazil. And I think that momentum needs to be built up as well. And just one point about COVAX, which we were talking about in the beginning around vaccine selection. COVAX has also not signed contracts with the Russians or the Chinese as yet. And so, the vaccine selection is not just the geopolitics around vaccine selection is not just influencing bilateral agreements, it's also influencing, for example, what COVAX is saying they are able to support and provide for low-income countries. And you know that they're way off targets. I mean, every single manufacturer is behind their production targets. COVAX said that it would supply about 2 billion doses of vaccines for low and middle-income countries. It's only able to, so far, supply 40 million. So there's a huge mismatch in what it actually tried to do or what it's promised and what it's actually able to do on the ground. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Jorge, I don't know if you want to come in. I know also in Brazil there's been, in addition to the global debate, there have been some specific demands that the Brazilian government should step in and impose some kind of compulsory licensing that would partly, I guess, rather like was done for the AIDS drugs back in the day.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, I think my thought, we don't expect the current government in Brazil to support a waiver, because initially they aligned with Trump's administration in the US against the waiver. And now they issued a communication jointly with Australia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, New Zealand, Norway, and Turkey, more or less going on the third way that WTO DG pushed recently. And of course, this Brazil currently is disregarding traditional partnerships, especially the BRICS and other blocs also. But we have at least 8 proposals of bills in the National Congress supporting compulsory license, effectively automatic, for technologies associated with COVID. Some of them are very similar to the waiver, and others are similar to just saying any technology patented or being analyzed for patent protection related to the pandemic, during the pandemic, must not be monopoly, must be automatically out of patent protection. And this has been discussed. We have at least 8 bills proposals. One of them is signed by 11 members of parliament of different political parties. Also, some political members of parliament have issued a letter to the WTO DG asking her to continue with the compulsory with the waiver. And this is ongoing. We have had strong support. This week, they circulated a letter signed by 152 civil society organizations in Brazil, supporting the waiver and supporting compulsory license in the Brazilian law. But it has a strong opposition from industry and from the government currently. So we are discussing that. It was discussed last week. It will be discussed again on Thursday. Thursday, I will join a debate on compulsory licensing that are circulating in the Congress in Brazil. And of course, we have lots of support, but we will also have lots of opposition. And the only compulsory license that Brazil issued was in 2007 for evidence. But it was a different government, a different alignment of forces within the government that were ready to move on that, because Merck didn't negotiate to lower the price. And now I think we have a different political situation, very complex in Brazil, as you all know, of course, but we're still pressuring to see if it's possible to be approved in the Congress to have compulsory licenses effectively automatic during the pandemic crisis on technologies associated with COVID, not only vaccines, of course, including vaccines, but not only vaccines. We have all these monoclonal antibodies and polyclonal antibodies that have just been approved here in Brazil. So we hope that if we have a treatment for COVID, also we can have compulsory lines. That's what we expect, of course, but we're not sure that we will be able to obtain that, because we have a very strong opposition of the government and of the industry, of course.
Okay, thanks. Gonzalo, I think you wanted to come in.
Bien. No, solo, digamos, que creo que ya más o menos quedó claro un poco el debate sobre lo que está pasando con la discusión de patentes. Solo quizás a mí me gustaría introducir dos aspectos complementarios a la discusión, ¿no? de patentes. Primer cuestión, una breve caracterización de qué mercado farmacéutico y qué dinámica geopolítica está teniendo el complejo médico farmacéutico global, ¿no? Porque creo que ahí también nos da algunas pistas, algunas claves de cómo comprender los cambios que se han ido ocurriendo también entre el siglo XX y el siglo XXI en la producción, distribución de vacunas, cómo las vacunas están dentro de un entramado del complejo farmacéutico global y demás, ¿no? Como un aporte muy, muy rápido. Y ahí por ahí detenerme en algún comentario que hice sobre los mecanismos globales, ¿no? O sea, me parece que ya todas y todos lo tenemos claro, pero digamos que este complejo farmacéutico global es un complejo entramado justamente industrial productivo, pero también financiero y también generador de demanda inelástica, digamos, no solo en el consumo de fármacos y tecnología sanitaria y toda esa estructuración de los mercados que implica eso, digamos, ¿no? Yo creo que algo así como hoy el mercado farmacéutico estará moviendo algo así como más de 1.200 miles de millones de dólares al año, y es un mercado que tiene una concentración geopolítica y una clara reproducción de dependencia, es decir, todo eso que conocemos como las Big Pharma, digamos que muchas de ellas justamente son esas 17 grandes, digamos, jugadoras o corporaciones farmacéuticas, pero que también ahí está metido el sistema financiero, están metidos otro tipo de esquemas de concentración y de lógica de mercado, ¿no? De esas 17, digamos, Big Pharma, hay muchas que están hoy involucradas en toda la dinámica, no solamente de producción, distribución y de mercantilización de las vacunas del SARS-CoV-2, porque eso sería una parte, digamos, ¿no? Como de la película o del gobierno global, digamos, que nos plantea la salud global liberal, donde, bueno, ya sabemos, ¿no? O sea, no solo Pfizer, sino Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Janssen, o sea, muchas de ellas que las escuchamos hoy como productoras de las vacunas están metidas en todo este entramado del grupo de las Big Pharmas del norte global, que sin duda tienen toda una dinámica de patrones de lucro, de accionar geopolítico sanitario, pero yo me detendría un poco en la situación particular, ¿no? No solamente en esa geopolítica centro-periferia que tienen estos mercados, sino en realidad cómo de alguna manera, toda esa dinámica y de ese complejo industrial, farmacéutico, global y financiero ha colonizado el gobierno de la salud internacional. Es decir, de alguna manera, y después quizás nos podamos detener unos minutos en la epistemología, es decir, digamos, toda la epistemología que nos plantea tanto la doctrina panamericana en salud en América Latina y la doctrina de la salud global liberal a nivel mundial. Pero sin duda cuando hablamos digamos, de estos jugadores, de estas Big Pharma, de toda la estructuración del complejo industrial farmacéutico global, de toda la dinámica geopolítica que tiene mucho de guerra de posiciones en la economía mundo, en primer lugar lo primero que nos aparece es que, digamos, preguntarnos por qué, digamos, de alguna manera, tanto la Coalición para Innovaciones de Preparación de Epidemias, eso que llamamos por las siglas en inglés CEPI, ¿no? Es básicamente una asociación público-privada que se crea en el 2015 en el Foro Mundial de Davos, digamos, los grandes promotoras de la CEPI son no solamente digamos, ¿no? el fondo filantrópico de GlaxoSmithKline y de otras farmacéuticas que ya venían con ejercicios pandémicos y que de alguna manera son las que de alguna manera también están apadrinando, ¿no? Fueron los padres de alguna manera de promotores de la vacuna de Moderna y de otras dinámicas, ¿no? Entonces, la CEPI y el Fondo Global de Vacunas, la Alianza Mundial de Vacunas, ¿no? Del Gavi, el Gavi hoy está financiado en un 60%, su financiamiento proviene de estos propios actores de la industria farmacéutica, ¿no? O sea, siempre recordamos a algunos autores como Germán Velázquez, que estuvo en la Organización Mundial de la Salud, y otros actores que en realidad uno sabe que, ¿no? Lo que llamamos el filantrocapitalismo sanitario, es decir, cuando un donante da dinero, cuando un jugador, ¿no? del complejo industrial farmacéutico pone financiamiento, sus representantes obviamente colonizan no solamente los comités de expertos y los comités de toma de decisiones, sino que en realidad el problema que tenemos que la propia Organización Mundial de la Salud está colonizada por estos intereses. Es decir, el mecanismo COVAX, digamos, sin duda, es el mecanismo garante de que no se discutan las patentes. Es decir, el mecanismo COVAX ha sido el mecanismo por el cual, digamos, el acceso a la vacuna se transformó en una especie de filantropía caritativa para los pobres del sur o para cuotas digamos, de lo que nos sobra en el mercado concentrado global, pero mientras tanto CEPI y Gavi, ¿no? se asociaban a la OMS, a la Organización Mundial de la Salud, en esta dinámica, por otro lado, digamos, no hay, digamos, toda la discusión, como recién decían, de los TRIPS y de los acuerdos de patentes, fue postergada varias veces el planteamiento de India y de Sudáfrica. Entonces yo creo que lo que ha dejado un poco en evidencia toda esta situación muy de coyuntura de la actual crisis epidemiológica del SARS-CoV-2, ¿no? Es de alguna manera la evidencia de que la autoridad, digamos, global de la propia OMS se encuentra colonizada por parte de intereses geopolíticos de la industria farmacéutica y de alguna manera de un acelerado proceso de privatización que ya muchos investigadores y actores de América Latina lo veníamos denunciando, de cómo distintos mecanismos de la Organización Mundial de la Salud cada vez más la despojaban de un actor de la salud pública, digamos, y la convertían en un actor o en una especie de árbitro epistemológico de la agenda global, de los mandatos globales de la salud, y esos mandatos globales de la salud desde los años 90 para acá, esos mandatos globales que lo representa mucho el concepto de salud global, por eso me detengo en el concepto de la idea de salud global liberal o la idea de mercados globalizantes de salud, en ese concepto se ha naturalizado todo el rol de las corporaciones internacionales, del propio complejo médico industrial, de las reformas radicales al Estado y a los sistemas de salud, como parte de la agenda de los mandatos globales, digamos, ¿no? Entonces, para nosotros desde la periferia o desde pensando desde, digamos, no solamente las vacunas, sino de los problemas de salud internacional, creo que nos tenemos que, de alguna forma, caracterizar esa situación, ¿no? O sea, caracterizar un poco el complejo médico-industrial y la situación de la propia OMS, pero también nos permite abrir algún debate teórico, ¿no? O sea, algún debate de la epistemología con que estamos comprendiendo los mandatos globales, porque nosotros tenemos la impresión de que estos mandatos globales y estos entramados, ¿no?, que se han ido produciendo no solamente en el mercado farmacéutico, sino digamos, en los mandatos de esta salud global liberal, se ha construido una diplomacia sanitaria, es decir, tecnocracias sanitarias, que están siendo, pudiéramos decir, ¿no?, en las universidades decimos que están siendo formateadas, que han sido formadas y preparadas para solamente administrar y gobernar estos mandatos globales. Entonces es muy
Gracias,
difícil.
Gonzalo. Perdón,
Sí,
tengo que pararte
perdón.
un poco porque
Sí.
algunos de los intervenientes tienen que quitar la reunión al media hora. So thanks a lot, Gonzalo. Unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our time. So I just wanted to ask I guess each of the panelists can leave us with one comment, one message, one question. And maybe Fatima, if I could take you first, because I know you have another obligation. Microphone, Fatima.
Thanks. I do apologize. It's Freedom Day in South Africa, and we have many battles to try and achieve substantive equality. So I just have to attend some other sessions. You know, my only plea is that once again we have a situation where profiteering and this desire to protect intellectual property at all costs is going to basically result in a lot of death and in a lot of suffering. And I think that the only thing we can do at this moment is to put pressure on the pharmaceutical industries to make sure that the vaccines that have been co-funded with a lot of public support and public funding, including, you know, clinical trials that we have participated in the global south to contribute to that scientific knowledge, that the pressure is not let up on them. Every single CEO, every single shareholder needs to justify why they refuse to share the know-how and the knowledge in the middle of a global pandemic, and why they insist on treating not just vaccines, but diagnostic kits, ventilators, a whole range of interventions that could assist us with this pandemic, why they refuse to give up the intellectual property on that, why they refuse to scale up and support and invest in greater manufacturing capacity. And then I think the second thing we have to do is hold our own governments to account. We need to, you know, ask our governments why they're still just relying on the waiver. Why aren't they ready to take more stronger compulsory licensing measures, use the Doha Declaration to its fullest? Why are they agreeing to non-disclosure agreements and basically succumbing to the demands of the pharmaceutical industry? You can't live in a world where 5 CEOs are in charge of the entire public health response to a pandemic. That is not a sustainable solution to the problems of public health in the world. And, you know, the ramifications for the next pandemic then are going to be dire. So that would be my plea. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Fatima. Kate, before you gave us some good examples of trades union and other movement mobilizations, I don't know if you can leave us with a bit more inspiring news.
Yeah, well, I think trade unions, as I said earlier, have responded to this campaign in a number of countries. Right now, we see the opportunity, I guess, even though there's a lot we're asking from health workers, but we do see the value of them having a voice in this debate. So we've been doing some campaigning with health workers, whether they be the primary health workers who are women in Pakistan who, have only recently won the right to a wage by unionizing previously, and in India they still aren't even entitled to a wage, but yet they're on the front line of the pandemic. Now that and they are still, for example, in Pakistan delivering the polio vaccine. And so what we've done is contrast that, which of course was one of the successes or almost successes of eradicating global disease using a vaccine that was not patented and them telling their story about the commitment they have to, for public health, global health, and putting their lives on the line, and contrasting that to, these 5 CEOs and the interests of the tiny minority. And that seems to cut through, I mean, not obviously with those governments themselves, but instead trying to use those in other countries. I mean, their story in the UK, where there's a motion, a cross-party motion that needs more supporters, for example, that, can cut through. In the US, trade unions have been instrumental, and there's a very clever campaign there, I think, to approach trade unions to use their, their power that they now have under the Biden administration in quite tactical ways. And, and I think it is growing with the G20. There's a Labor 20 that's adopted this campaign. And so part of PSI's first work was to get the rest of the Labor movement to support it, get the ITUC to support it, which they have now, and the Labor 20, and bring this to those for us. So I think now we can say that most of the Labor movement is behind it, and we just need to mobilise them more. And part of doing that is getting together with other organisations worldwide. We're working with MSF, Oxfam, and Amnesty, and groups like yourselves. And I think we can only win by growing power, and that power isn't just in the hands of the Labor movement. It's got to be global power of progressive movements together, and I think that's where there's hope.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kate. Dorothy, final thought and comment.
Yeah, well, it's really a pity that we don't have much time. I wanted to go back on the issue of geopolitics, and I wanted to emphasize that when analysts or writers talk about Moscow and Beijing vaccine diplomacy, it is important to understand that vaccine sharing is by no means the only way Moscow and Beijing are trying to expand their influence. So it is actually just a tiny, tiny scale when compared to, for example, Russian arms sales or China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Plan. I mean, China's Belt and Road Initiative is by far now the biggest economic partnership in the world, and it doesn't even have an FTA or free trade agreements. So meanwhile, it is also important to understand that China has 2 advantages over the West when it comes to why they can't send vaccines everywhere else. Also, this is because China has swiftly crushed its own outbreak. 2 months after, 3 months after Wuhan, it's back to normal. There were pictures of people swimming and splashing on a swimming pool with bubbles, those colorful balls. So that means it doesn't have the urgency to keep vaccines at home. It can send vaccines out, and that's important to consider. Now, the other countries like the US are feeling, okay, how do we, are we losing the war when it comes on propaganda or when it comes to vaccine diplomacy? I used the propaganda before, sorry about that. What I mean is that when it comes to reporting, China and Russia are, I think, better when it comes to projecting that or showing that they are winning the war on vaccine diplomacy, because they are sending it directly to the southern countries. A particular concern in the Philippines is that although vaccine is very much needed, there's 110 million population and only 2-point-something million doses came from the COVAX facilities. Jointly, we received, the country received from AstraZeneca and from Sinovac. Although majority of the Filipinos would rather want the other vaccines, the problem is if the Chinese vaccine is the only thing available, so it is better to have or pile up and not pile, fall in line to get that vaccine that is available than wait for other vaccines that may or may not be available in the next 1 or 2 years. An example is Egypt. It has been getting billions of US aid. But when it ordered from AstraZeneca, from Pfizer, from Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, and Sinovac, and the first one that arrived was the Chinese vaccine. So that is a real race. And when we talk about real race, China is quite good in winning the race of getting the vaccine sent to the countries. Of course, the question there in the Philippines particularly is, are the vaccines coming in exchange of allowing the Chinese get in control of the South China Seas, or the Western Philippine Seas as we call it. So this would require another discussion, because for the Philippines and the other ASEAN countries, that is an important issue, because the Chinese are putting up infrastructures, airports, facilities on those reefs, and people in the Philippines are afraid that those vaccines may be coming in exchange for those islands and reefs.
Something fishy with their offer of generosity. Okay, thanks. Jorge, sorry, just a minute or two for a final comment.
Yeah, just a final comment. I think my final reminder would be to remember everybody that all countries that have signed the TRIPS agreement also have signed the TRIPS flexibilities. It's a right of the countries to use the TRIPS flexibilities, and we cannot be threatened for using the TRIPS flexibilities. North countries use very much TRIPS flexibilities in IT and in other areas. And I think we have the right to use them. That's a thing that I would like to mention, because everybody is concerned about using TRIPS flexibilities. And the report from the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines says very clearly as a recommendations, governments and the private sector must refrain from explicit or implicit threats, tactics, or strategies that undermine the right of WTO members to use TRIPS flexibility. We saw this week, Russia is issuing a compulsory license for remdesivir, and Gilead is suing the Russian government. I think that's unacceptable, because it's a right of the country to use TRIPS flexibility for government use, to make sure that availability will be conserved, that sustainability will be achieved. So I think that would be my final message. The TRIPS flexibility is absolutely correct, right? And it's a right of the countries to use them. And we have to support the waiver, because a waiver is a way to move forward in enabling countries to use TRIPS flexibilities to use compulsory license. Otherwise, we will be stuck in months of negotiation, product by product, in country by country. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks very much. Sorry, we've run out of time. So thank you very much to all of the panelists, but this is a discussion which we're all continuing as part of a broad global movement on these issues. We recorded this webinar, and we'll put it on our website probably tomorrow. And yeah, we stay in touch, and we continue collaborating. So thanks to all of our panelists, thanks to our interpreters and the technical team managing the live streams and so on, and look forward to discussing with you again next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Special thanks to all of those who had to get up very early, or for whom it's already bedtime.